It begins with a photograph. At first glance, it's ordinary. A sepia family portrait from the early 1900s. A father with a solemn jaw. A mother whose expression refuses to smile. Children arranged neatly in front of them, hands clasped, faces still. But if you stare too long, something feels wrong. Their eyes don't meet the camera. Or perhaps they do, but too much, too knowing, too aware of something that no one dared to speak about. This isn't just a picture of a family. It's a record of a pact, one that would hold them together far longer than love ever could. The family lived on the edge of a small, forgotten town in rural Kentucky. A single house surrounded by woods, the kind of place where the only sound at night was the wind moving through the trees. And sometimes, not even that. Locals said they were private people, but privacy, in their case, wasn't a choice. It was survival. Generations of silence had taught them that the less the world knew, the better. Because behind those closed doors there were things shared that could never be unshared again. Their name is missing from most records, burned, rewritten, replaced. But fragments remain. A census here, a birth record there, enough to suggest something deeply wrong in the bloodline. Children born with the same unplaceable features, dates that don't line up, a son born too soon, a daughter too late. It's the kind of pattern that only makes sense when you realize the truth. They were one of those families that learned long ago to turn inward for everything they needed, even love. And yet, this isn't a story of madness or cruelty. It's something colder, something harder to explain. This was a family that believed in the idea of unity, not as a virtue, but as a rule. They shared everything: food, land, labor, and eventually the kinds of things that should never be shared. No one outside ever asked questions, and the few who did stopped. Because when you looked into their eyes, it felt like they already knew what you were thinking, and they dared you to say it out loud. The story that follows isn't legend. It isn't rumor. It's the unearthing of what one man found when he went looking for his roots, and discovered that his entire lineage had been bound together by something dark, secret and sacred. A vow that no one was ever meant to break. He was never meant to find them. His name was Daniel, a quiet man, middle-aged, divorced, the kind of person who found comfort in tracing the lines of history backward when the present felt too heavy. It started as a simple ancestry project, one of those mail-in DNA kits bought on a whim during a sleepless night. He wanted to know where he came from, but what he found wasn't heritage, it was contamination. The results came back fractured, almost nonsensical. Branches of his family tree looping back on themselves, names repeating where they shouldn't. He traced his mother's side to the same county as his father's, though neither had ever mentioned it. Something about the overlapping names, the same surnames appearing generation after generation, didn't make sense. At first he thought it was a clerical error. Then he saw the handwritten notes in old ledgers, same household, and the initials that matched his grandparents'. Daniel drove down to that county, a small patch of land that barely existed on a map anymore. No stores, no schools, just abandoned homes, swallowed by ivy and silence. He found the old homestead at the end of a dirt road, its windows boarded, roof sagging under the weight of decades. On the porch, someone had carved initials into the wood, the same ones he'd seen in the records. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the grooves like an echo from another lifetime. And for the first time he realized that his search wasn't about finding where he came from. It was about understanding why his family had tried so hard to forget. Inside the house, he found remnants, a cradle with hand-carved hearts, a trunk filled with family Bibles, and dozens of photographs. At first glance, they were the same people he'd seen online in old archives, but the longer he looked, the less certain he became. The faces blurred together, siblings who looked too Ali's, parents who seemed younger than their own children. It wasn't just shared blood, it was repetition, a cycle. Each generation folding back into itself like the pages of a closed book. In the back of one Bible, written faintly in pencil, were 6 words that made Daniel's blood run cold. We kept the family whole within. He didn't know what that meant, not yet. But as he stood in that dark, airless house, he swore he could hear something moving upstairs. Soft footsteps, slow, familiar, as if the family he was searching for had never really left. When Daniel finally gathered the courage to go upstairs, the air changed. It was heavier, dense, almost sweet with the scent of something that had been sealed away for too long. Each step creaked like a voice trying to warn him. The hallway was lined with portraits, oil paintings, old photographs, framed certificates, all faces of people who shared the same strange symmetry, the same eyes, the same mouths, the same weary, tired look of those who had seen too much and said too little. At the end of the hall was a locked door. The paint was chipped, the wood warped from age, but the lock itself was new, shiny brass, untouched by rust. Someone had been here recently. He found the key inside a drawer downstairs, taped beneath the remnants of a family Bible. When he turned it, the sound was almost ceremonial, like the final click of a secret being undone. Inside, the room was preserved, unnervingly so. A bed, neatly made, curtains still drawn, and on the wall, a series of photographs arranged like a shrine. Some were dated, 1912, 1934, 1956, each showing the same house, the same faces, the same pairings. At first, Daniel couldn't tell what he was looking at. But then he noticed the patterns, how each husband and wife looked nearly identical, too identical, brothers and sisters, cousins and cousins, the same surnames repeating across every frame, every generation. In the corner of the room sat a trunk sealed with rope. He hesitated, but curiosity had already become something stronger, obsession. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed lace and brittle letters, were journals, dozens of them, written by the women of the family. Their handwriting delicate, but their words trembling with the weight of what they could never say aloud. One entry, dated 1927, read, "Father says to keep the line pure. He says the blood remembers itself better this way." As Daniel read on, he realized it wasn't just one generation. It was all of them. An inherited belief passed down like scripture, that the family must remain whole, unbroken, unsullied by outsiders, that no one else could ever understand what bound them together. They didn't just share land or names, they shared each other completely. Downstairs, the wind had picked up. The front door slammed against the frame. Daniel looked up from the journal, and for a brief moment he thought he saw movement in the hallway mirror. A shape, pale and still, watching him, as though the house itself was remembering. That night, Daniel didn't leave. He couldn't. Something in that house felt magnetic, like the walls themselves were whispering for him to stay, to listen. He set up a small lantern in the center of the room, surrounded by the journals, trying to make sense of what he'd uncovered. But the deeper he read, the less it felt like history. It felt like confession. The earliest entries spoke of isolation, how the family had once been cut off from the nearest town by floods and failed crops, how the patriarch, Samuel, declared that God had chosen them to keep the family whole until salvation came. But by the next generation, that doctrine had shifted. The entries no longer mentioned God, only the blood, a sacred thing, a perfect thing, something they believed could only survive if it stayed within. Each writer described the same ritual, family gatherings by candlelight, always at the same time of year, when the leaves began to turn. They called it the keeping. No one outside ever attended. No one outside ever left afterward. Neighbors who lived close enough to hear the singing at night learned to mind their own business, because everyone who asked questions disappeared. Daniel found one final book buried beneath the rest. Its pages were soaked with something dark, the ink half dissolved, but the first line was still legible. "Tonight, we bring the last one home." The entry ended abruptly. No date, no signature, just a pressed flower folded between the pages, brown and brittle, but still faintly scented. He realized what that meant. Someone had been missing. Someone the family believed they needed to bring back into the fold. And suddenly, Daniel felt that chill again. The sense that his being there wasn't an accident. That maybe, after all these years, he was the last one. He stood at the window and looked out into the darkness. The forest around the house straw, etched for miles, thick and unbroken. But between the trees, he thought he saw light, faint, flickering, like candles moving in a line. Voices carried on the wind, low, chanting, familiar. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run, or would you open the door? He didn't sleep that night. Every sound in that house felt amplified, the shifting of the old timbers, the wind breathing through the cracks, the faint hum of something alive beneath the floorboards. By dawn, Daniel had convinced himself it was all just fear, exhaustion, imagination. He decided to leave. He packed his things, locked the trunk of journals, and took one last look at the family photographs on the wall. But then, something caught his eye, a single new frame that hadn't been there before. The photo was in color, modern, and it was of him, standing right where he was now in that same hallway. The same expression, the same light falling across his face. He dropped it instantly. The glass cracked, but the image didn't blur. It looked too real, as if it had just been taken seconds ago. He ran outside, into the cold morning air. The woods were silent again, the mist curling low over the ground like something alive. But the road he came in on was gone, swallowed by fog and overgrowth. Every direction he turned, he saw the same thing, trees, endless and still. It was as if the house had moved, or the world around it had shifted overnight. He called out. No echo, no birds, no wind, just silence, and the faint sound of footsteps coming from behind him. When he turned, there they were. The family. Not in flesh, but in form. Faint silhouettes moving together through the mist, faces indistinguishable but familiar in their posture, their stillness, and among them, one stood slightly apart. A woman older, her eyes sharp and sunken. Daniel recognized her from the journals. Margaret, the last recorded matriarch. She didn't speak. She only lifted a trembling hand and pointed back toward the house. He hesitated, but something deep inside, that same quiet pull that had brought him here, told him to obey. As he stepped closer, the figures began to fade, one by one, dissolving into the fog like smoke in water. By the time he reached the porch, only Margaret remained. Her lips moved silently. He strained to hear, but only caught one word, whispered, fragile, yet certain, home. The door creaked open on its own, and Daniel, heart pounding, crossed the threshold again, not as a visitor this time, but as if the house had been waiting for him to remember where he belonged. The inside of the house felt different now. No longer abandoned, not entirely. The air was warmer, and the faint smell of burnt wax drifted from somewhere deep within. Daniel followed it through the narrow hallways, his footsteps softer now, like he was walking through memory rather than dust. The walls seemed to close in around him. Family portraits that once looked faded now gleamed with new life, their painted eyes following his every move. He passed one of the mirrors in the hall, but his reflection didn't move. It just stared back, lips slightly parted, as if wanting to warn him, or welcome him. In the main room, he found the source of the light. Candles, dozens of them placed in a circle on the floor. In the center sat an old wooden chair, facing the window. Something rested on the seat, the same journal he had taken from the trunk. Only now, there was an additional entry written inside. His name, followed by today's date. He stared at it, every muscle in his body tightening. The handwriting wasn't his, but it felt familiar. Every loop, every curve, identical to his mother's old letters. The same hand that used to write his name on school lunches when he was a child. Below his name was a single sentence, underlined twice. The last one has come home. The wind rose suddenly, blowing out half the candles. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of movement again, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was pacing above him. But this time, Daniel didn't run. He climbed the stairs, one by one, each creak of the wood sounding less like fear and more like acceptance. At the top, the locked door stood open. Inside, the room was filled with mirrors, each one angled toward the center, where a single empty chair waited, and in every reflection, Daniel saw them. The family, standing behind him, their faces serene, their eyes calm, their mouths moving in silent unison. And he turned around, but there was no one there. Only the mirrors, endless, infinite, each one showing him where he came from and what he had always been a part of. Then from the reflection, Margaret appeared again, only this time she was closer. Close enough to reach out, her hand pressing against the glass from the other side. He felt the cold seep into his skin as her lips parted and she spoke, almost tenderly. The blood remembers. And as the last candle downstairs went out, Daniel finally understood. He hadn't found his family. They had found him. The police report said the house was empty. When they finally came looking for Daniel, weeks later, after friends reported him missing, they found his car rusting at the end of the dirt road, keys still in the ignition. The front door stood open, the air inside heavy with mildew and candle wax. There were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, no footprints. Just the faint scent of something sweet, almost floral, lingering in the air. In the parlor, they discovered a circle of burned-down candles, a half-rotted chair, and a journal lying open on the floor. Only one sentence was written inside. We kept the family whole within. The rest of the pages were blank. No sign of Daniel's belongings except for a photograph on the mantel, a new one printed in color. It showed him sitting in that same chair surrounded by a family no one could identify. Their faces were pale, their expressions still, but they all shared one feature in common. The same eyes, calm, familiar, watching. The investigation was closed within weeks. The property was condemned, the remaining structures sealed off. Locals still talk about the place, though few will admit they've ever gone near it. They say if you stand by the tree line at dusk, you can hear faint singing drifting through the air. A slow, rhythmic hum that doesn't quite sound human. Some claim they've seen lights flickering through the windows. Others swear they've seen people standing inside, hand in hand, staring out, always in pairs. But the strangest detail came from the officer who filed the final report. He wrote that before leaving the property, he took one last look through the photographs scattered on the floor. Among the old black and white prints, one caught his eye, a family portrait, cracked and yellowing. When he looked closer, he saw that someone new had been added to it, a man in a modern coat standing at the edge of the group. The ink hadn't faded yet, the face was unmistakable. It was Daniel. They said the photograph was destroyed when the evidence room caught fire years later. But if you ask around town, some still claim to have seen it. Passed from hand to hand, generation after generation, the image of the family that shared everything, even their secrets, even their blood. And if you ever find that picture for yourself, don't stare too long, because sometimes if you look closely enough, you might see a new face forming at the edge. Would you recognize it? Would it recognize you?